it's not like they ran an experiment and at the end of it, they said, oh, the results, the conclusion is life has no purpose, right? That's sort of a philosophical assumption. And a lot of it is grounded in this notion that evolution is a totally random and haphazard process. And that's simply not the case, especially in the last 20 or 30 years. Much of this is the work of a biologist at the University of Cambridge. He's there. That's where he was last time I checked, named Simon Conway Morris, who has discovered these patterns where evolution seems to be going in certain directions and not others. There's a lot we don't know exactly about why this is the case, but certain forms and functions have kind of recurred over and over and over and over again in evolution, such that there seems to be, in the words of Conway Morris, this is a process that is seeded with inevitabilities. And it's not just one random thing after another, right?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode. My name is Jacob Hansen. I'm the host of Thoughtful Faith, and today I am joined by Dr. Samuel Wilkensen. Dr. Wilkensen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Well,
I got to say, Dr. Wilkensen, I got a copy of your book recommended to me by a mutual friend of ours, Joseph Lawal. I believe. I'm not sure. How do you know Joseph, by the way?
He's a graduate student here at Yale, so he happens to be in my work. Very smart guy.
Yeah, I love Joseph, and he's the one who put us in touch with each other. And he said, you got to read this book by Samuel Wilkensen. And so I read it, and I loved it. And so today we're going to be talking about your book, but I want to give everyone a little bit of background about you, because I think that your background is pretty awesome. And so I'll just kind of read what I have here. Dr. Wilkenson is an associate professor of psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine, where he also serves as associate director of the Yale Depression Research Program. Dr. Wilkenson received his Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering, summa cum laude, from Brigham Young University, and later his medical degree from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He completed his residency at Yale, where he joined the faculty following his postgraduate medical training. His primary research has focused on depression and suicide prevention and has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. His research and articles have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Wilkenson has won various awards related to his work and research. He's an Eagle Scout. He served a mission in Nevada, where I'm from, actually in my hometown here in Reno, for a time at least. And in my opinion, most importantly, Dr. Wilkenson is a husband and father to 5 children. Yeah. So you're a busy guy, doctor.
Sam is just fine for our purposes. I am. Yeah, no, I've been fortunate to have a lot of opportunities unfolded to me. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, did we miss anything in the bio? There's a lot there. I mean,
that's plenty. That's plenty. Thank you.
All right. So anyway, this book. So the book, I'm going to put it here on the screen for everyone to see. The book that you wrote is called What Evolution and Human Nature Apply About the Meaning of Our Existence. That's the subtitle. Obviously, the title is Purpose. Okay, so that's kind of what it deals with here. And I want to ask you, if you were sitting on an airplane with someone and you're like, yeah, I wrote a book. Like, oh, what's it about? How would you kind of quickly, in a nutshell, summarize what this book is about?
There's a couple different levels. I mean, on one level, it's essentially about faith and science. And I wrote this book mainly from an experience I had when I was a medical student, where I went through this really wrestle with faith. And it seemed to me that science and faith were at odds. On another level, it's about human nature and evolution, and how, from a certain framework, we don't look to science necessarily for these types of answers often, but I think from a certain framework, the principles of human nature seem to imply that there is an overall purpose to our existence. So I lay that out in detail in the book.
Awesome. And it's got a lot of praise from some pretty big names, including Francis Collins, who is the leader of the Human Genome Project. I don't know that there's many people that know more about human genetics than him. Yeah. Arthur Brooks has praised it. You got people from MIT, from Princeton, all sorts of major institutions. People who've read the book have enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. And I guess my question, kind of first and foremost, is what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, so I decided to write this book based on an experience, really a series of experiences I had when I was a first-year medical student. As you mentioned, I had the fortune to attend medical school at Hopkins in Baltimore. And for whatever reason at this time in my life, I was kind of thrust into this, could describe it as existential crisis, where I thought that what science implied about, really about the meaninglessness of his existence was something I didn't like. And I spent several months really studying and thinking and praying. That was a big part of this. And in a way that's kind of hard to describe, things just fell into place in my mind, and things seemed to really make sense in a coherent way. And I decided at that point that I wanted to write a book. I had to put it on the shelf for about a decade while I finished medical school, and we started our family and finished residency and got my first faculty appointment here. And I picked that project back off the shelf right around the time that the COVID started. And so maybe two to 3 years of intensive writing. And then, it came out in March of 2024.
Awesome. Well, I got to say, I've noticed just in society generally, and I've kind of had to wrestle with these same questions. I often tell people that I went through sort of a faith, I don't call it a faith crisis, but a faith remodeling that I had to go through over a period of time. But it's interesting. A lot of people maybe struggle from different angles of belief. But for me, it was kind of the most fundamental questions, like, is there a purpose to my life and existence? Does God exist? And I enjoyed reading the book because I felt like it went to those really fundamental questions that a lot of people ask. And it does it from this scientific perspective, which is kind of, to some extent, where I went in my search on these issues. And kind of like you, I found things that were very satisfying. Now, one other thing is you deal in the world of depression and mental health and those kind of issues.
Yeah.
And I can't help but wonder if you think that there is a connection between what seems to be deteriorating mental health amongst people in society generally, especially in the West, and a decline in our belief in something transcendent. Do you think there's a connection there?
I do. I don't think it's the only reason. There's a lot of, especially in the last 20 years, 30, 40 even, with the breakdown of community, the breakdown in marriage in the West. Those are all significant contributions. But I think it's a big part of it, this sense that, life has no purpose. We are, the random accumulations of tens of thousands of molecular mutations and nothing more. And I do think in a maybe subtle but important way that has to do with this sense of maybe a collective sense of meaninglessness that our society is experiencing.
And I think, and you kind of address this in the book, and maybe now we'll start to get into some of the meat of the book, is sort of the idea that evolution is a blind and random process. And if human beings arose through a blind and random process, that then means that life is nothing more than a set of blind random processes that we just happen to be a part of. And I want to ask you first and foremost, obviously you address this in the book, what do you say to someone who thinks that, who says, well, isn't it just all just random process anyway?
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that bothered me. And I mean, the theory of evolution for a lot of people who are religious and have a belief in the divine has been a stumbling block. And part of it is this assumption, right? Many of the leading thinkers in evolution have said statements to that effect, that, there's no higher order purpose. There's this great quote that I think epitomizes it. It's attributed to this contemporary of Darwin, scientist contemporary of Darwin, who said, in In the inevitable march of evolution, life is of profound unimportance, a mere eddy in the primeval slime. Right? You kind of laugh at that today, but 15 years ago, that was very disturbing to me. And what I've come to realize is that it's not like they ran an experiment and at the end of it, they said, oh, the conclusion is life has no purpose, right? That's sort of a philosophical assumption. And a lot of it is grounded in this notion that evolution is a totally random and haphazard process. And that's simply not the case, especially in the last 20 or 30 years. Much of this is the work of a biologist at the University of Cambridge. He's there. That's where he was last time I checked, named Simon Conway Morris, who has discovered these patterns where evolution seems to be going in certain directions and not others. There's a lot we don't know exactly about why this is the case, but certain forms and functions have kind of recurred over and over and over and over again in evolution, such that there seems to be, in the words of Conway Morris, this is a process that is seeded with inevitabilities. And it's not just one random thing after another, right?
Yeah, and that was some of the points that you brought up in the book hit on that. There's a quote here I want to read from the book. You said, "But given the remarkable complexity of life, the assumption that the process was totally random must be questioned. Even Darwin's staunchest defenders have now acknowledged this. That some randomness was present is very likely, but there seem to be higher order chemical and physical laws that have guided evolution to produce the same biological forms over and over again. Some scientists are even starting to speak of deeper organizational principles that underpin evolution." Yeah. So you mentioned in the book too this sort of notion of all possible animals.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about that and how it maybe connects to some of this.
Yeah, and this actually comes from the writings of Richard Dawkins, who, as you might know, is probably the most outspoken atheist of our generation. So there's this sense, imagine if you can, a museum of all possible animals or forms. And, you start at one point and you see a tiger in front of you. And as you move west, the tiger's front teeth start to become a little shorter. As you move east, the teeth start to become a little bit longer. As you move north, the teeth stay the same, but the ears change slightly. As you move south, the ears change in the opposite direction. As you go up the elevator, one other trait changes ever so slightly while all the others stay the same. And as you think about that, you quickly realize that you need more than 3 dimensions to describe this museum, and it starts to become impossible to imagine it unless you're, of course, a mathematician or a physicist and can think in these tens of thousands of dimensions. And you quickly realize that the number of possible forms in the Museum of All Possible Animals is greater than the number of atoms in the known universe. Mm-hmm. Okay, so these are all the possible ones, but the actual forms that we find in nature are a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the possible forms that do exist. Now, I don't want to belittle the amazing diversity of the biological world, the biosphere, as mm-hmm. one might be. It's astounding the diversity that does exist, but compared to the theoretical diversity that could exist, it's like a tiny, infinitesimally small fraction. And not only that, is it only populated by a small portion of actual forms in biology, but those forms have recurred over and over and over and over again. This is this concept called convergence, where like we can go to lots of examples, but a really common one is eyes. Eyes have developed independently about 40 different times.
I want to pause there.
Yeah,
because it's important. I want the audience to make sure they understand what this means. To say that eyes have evolved independently multiple times. First of all, the eye in its complexity is just insane. But to say that the eye totally independently emerged in the exact same, essentially or largely the same kind of form over and over again, that's a big deal. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
Because it didn't have to, but it did.
It's not random. You know, again, the randomness may play some role, but I think it's a comparatively small one compared to what at least I originally assumed it did. When you hear about evolution, a lot of people think, oh, it's just this random, you know, and I think there is some level, but level of randomness, but it's comparatively small. So yeah, you know, the eye is one example, but you find out that, and this is an interesting point that Richard Dawkins himself makes. He asks a colleague of his, you know, can you think of, quote, good ideas in biology that have evolved only once? And his friend can only think of a handful, right? Of the, you know, I don't know, hundreds, if not thousands of, you know, different mechanisms or apparatus in biology, only a handful of them, at least according to this expert biologist at the University of Oxford, only a handful have evolved only once. So you get the sense that there are, you know, biologists would use the word constrained, that evolution is constrained to go in certain directions by physical and chemical properties. Again, there's a lot we don't understand about this.
And that in my mind is like to say that evolution is constrained by something, and that those constraints are what is yielding our, like, who we are and what we are.
Yeah.
That's really a fascinating question. Like it means, because if there are constraints, that, I mean, are those constraints totally random?
No, they're clearly not, because you see these things occurring over and over again, right? An analogy, if you'll allow me, the way I think of this is, so you mentioned in the intro, I studied engineering as an undergraduate, and there's a manufacturing process that is called injection molding. And when you have injection molding, you take a solid material, really commonly these days it's plastic, and you melt it, essentially. You heat it up until it becomes liquid. And while it's in the liquid form, you inject it into a hollow mold that has a predetermined shape and structure. And, you know, when this is how they make, a lot of times plastic bottles are made this way, Legos, and so forth. And if you can imagine, like, pausing the process and zooming in where you could see the liquid molecules, they're kind of bouncing around, it would look like they're randomly moving around. But when you take a step back, you see they're filling the form of a mold, of a shape, of a structure. And so, you know, again, at some level, at the close-up, it looks random, but you take a step back and you see this broad pattern. So you can imagine, you know, the shape of a mold like a tree, and these kind of mutations are feeling their way. They're constrained by the boundaries of the mold, but they're filling a predetermined form or structure. So I think that's a little bit of how it went about. There seems to be this mold that is inherent in the physical laws of the universe, and evolution may be kind of feeling out the edges of it. So
that's a great analogy. I love it. And if you want, I maybe I'll extend one of my own, and we'll see what you think of it. When you have one of the ways that you can detect if something has been designed or not, or is random, is that, you know, if we take like if I have a dice and I roll it, I should get a sequence of numbers that is random, right? All sorts of different results, right? They're all possible results. But if I roll that dice and I get a 1, and then again I get a 1, and then again I get a 1, and then again I get a 1. Over and over, you start going, there's something about this dice, some constraint that is causing it to fall on 1 every time. And so it's not, again, it's not random, because if it was random, if there were no constraints, it would be on any one of the numbers. And so, you know, and if evolution, if you have all possible animals that could possibly be formed, but yet they continue to fall into this narrow range, it's kind of like that dice. What's making it have to fall within that? And what you're implying, if I understand correctly, is that the actual sort of deeper laws, the chemical laws, or even then beyond chemistry go into physics, that those sort of laws are guiding the process that we see within biological evolution. Is that a fair way?
Yeah, I mean, something like that. I think it's pretty clear that it's not random. to someone who has a broad view of the biological world. We don't know a lot why that is the case. You know, is it the physical laws? Were the mutations actually random? I mean, when I think about it, there's a part of me, it's like, I'm not sure I can fathom that the mutations were actually random. Now, I can't go back in time and prove one or the other, but you know, you can't necessarily prove that they're totally random, at least, you know, millions of years ago. So that is what I think it is like, right? I do think there is some randomness, like your eye color may be determined by the random reassortment of your parents' genes, but the fact that you have eyes and they're structured the way they are seems to be inherent in the biological principles of matter. And, you know, if this process could unfold on any other planet where the same principles of optics and light and so forth held, then you would very likely see eyes. So it is really fascinating to think of these kind of deep principles. There's a lot we don't know about it, but it's pretty clear that that biology was not random, or at least not in total. Right?
Well, and your book has a particular word in its subtitle that I think is really important, because you say what evolution and human nature imply about the meaning of our existence. Because this stuff that we talked about so far, these are things that I've kind of heard about before and been interested in before. But I think where your book did something unique and interesting, in my opinion, in this whole conversation, was to ask what the implications are. If it's not random, can we learn anything about what perhaps that purpose could be, or our purpose could be, based on where evolution seems to be guiding us towards? And there was a quote in the book that I really liked. You quoted Charles Towns, who said, "Science tries to understand what our universe is like and how it works, including us humans. Religion is aimed at understanding the purpose and meaning of our lives, including our own lives. If the universe has a purpose or meaning, this must be reflected in its structure and functioning, and hence in science." And so it's almost like this reverse engineering, where you're taking what you're observing and you're saying, but what does this imply if there is a purpose about it? So what does, in your opinion, this, what is nature implying here about our purpose?
Well, I think to go there, so let's shift and pivot a little bit away from this non-randomness. I mean, to be intellectually honest, that doesn't necessarily prove, right, or you know, the non-randomness of our coming into existence. For me, it makes a lot more space, and it's a lot more satisfying to imagine a deity that, you know, instead of leaving the creative process up to total randomness, had in some way, ways that we don't quite understand, it was constrained or guided, or whatever word you want to use. But it still doesn't get us to, okay, it's non-random. Life is not necessarily an accident, but that doesn't, at least for me, it's not a home run quite yet. So if you want to get to the purpose,
and I think a lot of people get to that point. It's not the home run. It's like, okay, so you can say it's not random. That doesn't
do it for me. Yeah, whatever. So to get there, I think we need to look at human nature. And this was going back to the genesis of the ideas of the book. This was something that was also disturbing to me, is what I thought evolution implied about human nature, right? So a lot of people, when they think about evolution, they think of, there's this term, survival of the fittest. Most people have probably heard of it. And when you think of it, you're like, I mean, selfish, greedy, right, aggressive, and that sort of thing. And, you know, is this really who we are? And as you dig into it, it's more complex. And I will certainly concede that we do have that aspect to our natures. Like, it doesn't take long to look for examples in the news and history of ways in which we behave in terribly selfish and even violent ways with one another. But at the same time, we seem to have this kind of opposing nature that can lead to examples of moral heroes, people who are unselfish, are kind and altruistic and peaceful and cooperative, right? And there's this, I mean, human nature is just full of contradictions. And you know, many atheists have observed this. You know, Sam Harris, I have a quote by him there that he was trying to show, oh yeah, you know, no creature matches us for the ability to cooperate, but also no creature matches us for sadistic cruelty. And he's right. You know, he is right. There's this dual potential, what I call the dual potential of human nature. And I think the most elegant way to explain how this came about is to take this phrase survival of the fittest and to turn it into a question and to say survival of the fittest what? Okay. Are we talking about a survival of the fittest individual, or is it a survival of the fittest maybe family or group? And this is what biologists refer to as the levels of selection. And when you think about it, the social traits that emerge from those different levels are going to be in opposition. Okay. Let me try to drive this home with a brief story, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So in 1864, there were 2 shipwrecks that occurred at the same time and place at what are called the Auckland Islands. These are islands that are about 300 miles south of mainland New Zealand. And the islands are sufficiently large that the survivors of the shipwrecks never learned of one another's presence. The first ship was led by a man named Thomas Musgrave. And after about a year and a half of a harrowing ordeal, fortunately, all of the men from his shipwreck survived. But the other ship was led by a man named George Dalgarno. And unfortunately, most of the crew from his ship died and did not survive. There were a few survivors. But so you ask, okay, what was the key difference? Well, the key difference was that Musgrave's ship, their crew formed this remarkably cohesive and altruistic group. And this was really epitomized in the first few minutes of the shipwreck when the captain himself, he carried an injured man on his back as he swam through the waves to the safety of the shore. Dalgarno's group, unfortunately, they kind of took an every man for himself approach. And within the first day or so of shipwrecking, they left a wounded man behind to die on the shore while they searched further inland for food and other resources. So, you know, you can imagine a lot of similar scenarios in our, you know, ancient past when it was cooperation and not selfishness that was helpful for survival, right? Because, you know, the group, at a group level, that is what is going to lead to a coherent and cooperative group. There are 2 biologists that really sum this up very, very nicely when they state, you know, selfishness beats altruism within groups, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups, and everything else is commentary. And I feel like that is a principle of almost like eternal truth, right? And you think about the different levels. And I think this is one of the ways in which nature has created within us these competing dispositions.
Yeah, because and you can see, again, it creates that dual nature. You know, you have the within you the desire to be altruistic, but you also have the desire in you to be selfish.
Yeah.
And what you're pointing to here, if I'm not mistaken, is the idea that yes, that's correct, and that nature can help us to understand why that we have that, but nature itself seems to be constrained to create those sorts of conditions. Is that a fair summation?
Well, yeah, I think so. You know, so the conclusion from this brief part of the discussion is that, look, we have these competing natures within us, is opposition, right? We have the capacity for selfishness, but also altruism, aggression, but also cooperation, promiscuity, but also monogamy. You know, it's a little more complicated when it comes to that, but it is true that, you know, we are pulled in these different directions. When you combine that with the sense that we have free will, what in religious terms we refer to as agency, it seems to be that life is a test of character. And we're, you know, one of the reasons that we're here is to choose between the good and the evil that is inherent within us.
I love it. And there was another thing I was thinking about as you were saying that, is that And it isn't necessarily that you always are to choose one or the other in terms of some of these, because, you know, for instance, without the drive of sexual promiscuity at all, we might not have any desire to reproduce whatsoever. And so it's like that. There's a side of it that needs aggression, for instance. Aggression isn't necessarily something that is bad. It needs to just be integrated properly within a person. And so you have these competing natures that, and maybe the test is to figure out how to properly integrate them. Because that's what leads to survival and the continuation of life, is if they're properly integrated rather than being sort of allowed to just run wild. Is that, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, you know, we're drawing on the work of like tons and tons and tons of scholars, but as we think about, right, the ability to cooperate and to be altruistic, there are a lot of scholars who look at this, and they bring up an aspect of human nature that that has to do with group psychology, and the fact that this is sometimes called in-group and out-group bias. So we tend to form groups, and those that we identify with, we treat them differently than those that we identify as outside our group. Okay. And, you know, there's lots of ways that we can define a group. And in some ways that's encouraging, because that's a very malleable concept. But it's very, very well replicated that, you know, if we have a common enemy, we're going to cooperate better. A lot of politicians and statesmen over the years have noticed this, that war unites, and in some cases have instigated wars for the purpose of unifying their country. And you know, the economists, the social scientists who have observed this, at least in evolutionary terms, will say that in their models, if they take out the outgroup part of it, the altruism doesn't necessarily form. And so that you couldn't have had this strong drive to cooperate unless there was also this this notion to treat others differently, less favorably, who are outside of the group. So that, you know, this, sometimes these are termed xenophobia and ethnocentrism, that you couldn't have had one without the other. This deep kind of group love that we have the capacity for couldn't have developed without the ability to hate outsiders. And I don't know if that's true. No one knows exactly if that's true, because they weren't there to see it unfold. And, you know, sometimes models can be spectacularly wrong, but it's an interesting, you know, that you couldn't have had one without the other. And I imagine that it might be the case for a number of other traits as well, that seem to be in opposition to one another.
Absolutely. And now, one other subject, you kind of touched on it there for a minute, is this subject of free will.
Yeah.
Because that's another one that it's a massive topic. I've had entire episodes on it, talking with different people and philosophers about it. And there is sort of the rhetoric out there that science has sort of proven that we don't have free will. You got the Sapolskys and others who will kind of say that, Sam Harris, and that our brains ultimately govern us, and our brains are governed by physical laws. And so we are determined creatures that, as Richard Dawkins said, that dance to the music of our DNA. And so what do you say to those who kind of have doubts about the existence of free will at all?
I think there's a compelling case to be made that free will is a real thing. You know, to me, it's well, not simple. This is not a simple topic. It's a fascinating and very deep topic. But there are two things. Okay, if I could show you one, that our behavior is not deterministic, that you know, that you can't predict our behavior, and in other words, there's some freedom. Okay, there's some wiggle room for there to be free will, and two, that I could show that, okay, your thoughts actually cause, or at least influence, your behaviors in a causal way. To me, that satisfies the definition of free will. So, I mean, and those line up with the term, right? You have free, this free part, which implies indeterminism, and the will part, which implies, okay, there's what we would call top-down causation. In other words, that your mental thoughts determine or at least influence your behaviors. And I think there's compelling evidence to be had that both of those conditions are satisfied. Even relatively simple organisms will respond in ways that are probabilistic and not deterministic. So you'll have a cockroach and it will flee in an unpredictable way at a given stimulus. You'll have a leech that in a certain condition will either crawl or it will swim, and you can't predict beforehand what it's going to do. By the way, I can't ever prove. I don't think anyone can ever prove that free will is real, at least with the constraints of today's philosophy and scientific kind of framework. But as far as we can tell, behavior, even among relatively simple organisms, is not deterministic. Okay. And go ahead.
Well, what is and because I've thought a lot about this, and as I read in the book, as you talked about some of this sort of idea of that our willing something can actually alter our brains, because there's sort of the idea that the brain runs everything, but yet, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you didn't go into this specifically in the book, or maybe you didn't use the terminology, but sort of this idea of neuroplasticity, the idea that you can actually affect outcomes of things, like you can change the working of your brain through the will. Do you think that is something is that possible?
Well,
am I on the right track?
Certainly the brain can change, right? That's the concept of plasticity. The brain adapts and in a structural way can reconfigure itself to adapt to the environment. I think the best literature to show that your thoughts can influence your behavior comes from psychology. And there's a number of different experiments. This is well replicated, where, say you'll have two groups and you'll say you want both groups to exercise. But one group, you give specific details. I want you to think out the details. When are you going to exercise? How are you going to do it? What time of day? That sort of thing. The other group, you just say, just exercise. And at the end of the period, those that really think about it are going to be much, much more likely to carry through with the behavior. So a lot of free will deniers will say, look, our thoughts don't influence anything. They are a byproduct, right? They're this kind of non-causal observer to the gears turning in the brain, right? The direction of causation only flows from the bottom up, right? Somehow we don't understand a lot of this, but the nerves and the neurons and the neurotransmitters, they cause your thoughts to happen, your feelings to happen. And so you can't have, and certainly there's a lot of evidence for that to be the case, right? If you get drunk or something, your behavior is going to change because of a physical thing in your brain that is causing, in a bottom-up causation direction, is influencing your behavior, right? And so they say, well, the direction of causation can only flow from the bottom up. It can't flow from the top down, right? That doesn't make any sense. And that's not the case because, well, there's a lot of reasons that's not the case, but these things don't happen instantaneously, right? It's like like instead of, how about using an example of American football? So in American football, you have in the play, the players are moving around and there's kind of bottom up causation. What the players are doing determines what the team does. Okay. And so you might say, well, the team can never act as a coherent thing because whatever the players are doing, that's what determines what the team does. But there's a huddle, right? There's a, the play is dead. The players come back and they make a decision as a team. And they say, oh, the nose tackle's off this, let's run it up center, whatever. They act as a team during the huddle, and they cooperate and collaborate and make a shared decision. And I think that's what it's like, how there can be both bottom up causation and top down causation, because these things are not happening instantaneously. They're happening very, very quickly, on timescales that you and I, is a fraction of the blink of an eye. But I hope I'm not losing some of your audience, but there's a lot of intricacy to this, but it's very, very clear from psychological literature, there is such a thing as top-down causation, meaning what you think influences what you do. That I don't think that can be questioned given the bulk of the evidence. And to me, that is enough to satisfy, along with the indeterminate nature of behavior, that there is free will.
And you hit on another thing in the book that had to do that I think sort of shatters the idea that we just dance to the music of our DNA. That there's sort of the idea of a lot of determinists is, okay, you have genetics, and those genetics are going to basically determine who you are and what you do, and so you are determined by your genetics. But you challenge that notion with a much more interesting, I think, and more nuanced take as to the way that genes interact with their environment and the way that they're turned on or off. And try and help us understand a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, and a lot of this comes from, again, Robert Sapolsky, who I agree with in so many ways, but disagree with in other fundamental ways. I mean, he's a brilliant guy. Genes, it doesn't make any sense to ask the question, what does a gene do? Only what does a gene do in a particular environment? And by environment, it can be like the microenvironment of that particular cell. It can be like, where that cell is in the body, or it can be like the actual environment. So I think the notion that you're getting at is this notion of genetic determinism, right? That we are pre-programmed from birth to behave in certain ways. And that's certainly not the case. I mean, we are the creatures that are probably of the kingdom of life. We're probably the most adaptable creatures in terms of the ways that our environment can impact us, and ways that we can impact the environment. So I think there's quite a bit of evidence that genetic determinism just doesn't really make sense. Another thing that free will deniers will sometimes, the argument they'll make, and Sam Harris, I think, makes this, is that, look, you can do what you want, but you can't will what you want, right? Your wants are kind of pre-programmed. And that is just, I think that's just so overly simplistic, because anyone who's lived a life can recollect experiences where they want two opposing things, right? Yes. I want to be fit, but I also want to eat, the dish of brownies that my daughter made. And these are opposing desires. We have to choose. I just, this notion that everything was pre-programmed at the time of the Big Bang, from who you're going to marry to the way that the comets twirl around their universe, that just is so far removed from our actual experience. It's just, I mean, it frankly is, not to be offensive, but it's kind of absurd.
Well, I agree. And that's the conclusion that I've come to as well, both from the study of sort of philosophy, but also from the study of the science itself. I mean, things like the genetic stuff that you're talking about, where genes can be, how does a gene respond within a given environment? That's a totally different thing. Because I tend to think okay, maybe your genetics give you a predisposition to something. Fine.
Yeah, I think they do. Yeah.
But the environment that you're in can affect the way that those genes very much interact. And then to what degree do you have some level of control over your own behavior? Because the real scary implication of the hard genetic determinism is to say that, the reason someone's successful, it's because of their genes. Someone's not successful, it's because of their genes. And it really gets into an area where, when you remove free will, and I'm not just saying that it has scary implications and therefore it's not true. What I'm saying is that we all know through our own experience, direct experience, the most, I don't think there can be anything more compelling in evidence than something that you directly experience when it comes to free will. And I think, as you've pointed out in your book, that the science backs that, because there are sort of within us conflicting natures that we end up having to choose between.
Yeah.
So One other thing that is interesting is the way that, again, I want to get into those implications of this, especially when it comes to things like relationships with other people. I really loved this part of the book. You said you said the journalist and social activist Dorothy Day described her experience as follows with her having a child. She says, if I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, and painted the most beautiful painting or carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I felt after the birth of my first child. And you say, or end quote, and then you say, many parents can relate to this. The birth of a first child can induce within a parent a depth of joy and love that was previously not fathomable. It's like you discover another chamber in your heart that you didn't know existed. This is because of the way in which evolution has shaped us. Family relationships represent the most powerful forms of love and affection that nature has created. And the implication here, if I'm not mistaken, is that you're saying that nature implies the centrality of family and family relationships due to those. It's almost like the broader principles that govern the natural processes of evolution have pointed us to where relationships within a family are the most meaningful and important.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, from one frame of reference, evolution is very pro-family, right? And I think we haven't recognized that. And this is what I'm trying to draw attention to. That, you know, one aspect to this is how immature our offspring are, right? When they are born, we're kind of at the one end of the spectrum when it comes to this. And a lot of scientists have noticed this, and this is where this what's called attachment theory comes from, is that, you know, that infant that is so helpless needs the care and concern of a parent. And kind of by necessity, these parents have, you know, parents over evolutionary time, human parents have developed this incredibly deep sense of love and loyalty and care and concern for their children. This is kind of written into the way that evolution works. And you know, I think the deepest form of love comes from, at least in the flesh, comes from the way that nature has shaped the relationship between parent and child. And some people might take a cynical view at this and say, "Oh, are you just saying I love my kids because they have my genes?" And I would say, well, that is how you were created. You were created to love your children. That is like in your DNA, right?
Yeah, and I guess sort of the presupposition that person has is that that's just random. It just so happens to be that I love my children because that's just what happens to be the case because of the evolutionary random process. But if evolution is not a purely random process, then that would imply that whatever is behind this creation, and we don't have to go into any specific sort of notions of deity, but whatever this creative force is that's controlling the big picture has designed it in such a way so that you love your child and that this is what brings you the deepest joy. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah. And, you know, it's also interesting because we can delve into this further, but so it's a bit of a mystery. Why would it's very easy to explain promiscuity from an evolutionary perspective, right? But clearly we also have the capacity to form long-term pair bonding or monogamous relationships. And why have we done that, or how have we done that? And a lot of people, most scholars probably who study this, they think that the parent-child relationship has been, the scientific term is exapted, or like adapted externally to allow for long-term kind of romantic relationships. And there's different lines of evidence that support this. One is from a kind of a neuroendocrine way, is that, you know, the hormone oxytocin in pretty much every mammal that's been studied, one of the purposes is to bind the mother to the child. But in those species that do have some monogamous capacity, and including us, it has also relatively recently, in evolutionary terms, been kind of adapted to also allow for long-term pair bonding between, you know, male and female. It's interesting. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Freud, but he wasn't entirely wrong when he was thinking of this relationship between a young child. You know, you love your mother, you're jealous of your father. There's a little bit of truth to that. It's not taking it too far, I think, leads us down crazy paths that we don't want to go. But that may have some root for, at least in the flesh, our capacity for monogamy.
So within our own individual lives,
yeah,
we can see that, you know, the deepest satisfactions that come through these relationships that we have with other people, and with the most important relationships being family, which is funny because we all sort of know this. It's like, this is just telling us what we all know, but it's giving a more sophisticated explanation as to why.
Yeah.
And then, but then we can go beyond that, because there's sort of the good society, right? You have a chapter that kind of talks about that. Well, what do you see as the implications of this sort of a view on what the good society looks like, or the, you know, if we have a purpose for us sort of individually to have these kind of relationships, what does that imply about our purpose as a society?
Well, let's go back to free will a little bit here. So I am entirely comfortable describing human behavior not in deterministic terms, but in probabilistic terms, right? And I think that, you know, if behavior weren't in some way at least probabilistic, then things like policies or advertising wouldn't really have any effect, right? We are shaped, our decisions are influenced by, you know, the world around us, our biological makeup. And so the question I ask is, how can we help ourselves to choose the better aspects of our nature, the better angels of our nature, to quote Lincoln? And I think the most fundamental way to do that is to help situate us in family relationships. And I think one of the reasons for this is because, you know, going back to this levels of selection issue we were talking about, are we talking about survival of the fittest individual or the fittest group or family, right? The strongest forms, when you think about all the positive aspects of human nature, they come through, at least they have their origins in the flesh, in the way that nature shaped our relationships with other people, right? And the strongest aspect of that is with our kin, with those with whom we share genetics. And especially when you link men to their families, to their biological children, they are going to behave in better ways. And I think that's because the origin of that pro-social nature in the flesh has its roots in the way that evolution shaped those family relationships. That's where they come from. So when you link men to their biological children, they will behave in ways that are better. And there's no guarantees, right? I mean, we know of fathers who have done terrible things with their, you know, wives and children, but statistically, I think the social science data are very clear on this. That, you know, when you link men to the children, and by the way, the cultural way we do that is through marriage. That they are going to behave in ways that are better for themselves and better for society.
Yeah, and I mean, it's obvious. I've spent some time looking into the social research literature on the effect, and you obviously have some of this in the book as well, but the immense effect that a father in the home, a good father, can have on a society, especially just because men tend to be the one who needs something to hook them in more, because women have a little bit more of a biological sort of connection there, where men maybe need a little extra kick in the pants to make sure they take responsibility for their loved ones and their society.
I think it's more than a little kick in the pants. You know, I mean, there's a fundamental imbalance in the strength of ties between men and women, and there's, you know, just basic biology that is related to that. And you know, we don't have to go into nuts and bolts, but it's possible for a man to conceive of a child and not even know it, right? There's a somewhat cynical quip among some social scientists that, you know, motherhood is a fact and fatherhood is an opinion. I don't necessarily agree with that, but you see where they're getting at, right? And because of this, it's important to have a strong cultural mechanism to link men to their children. And for, you know, for most of society, most of history, that has been one of the express purposes of marriage.
Okay. So as we get kind of low here on time, I want to try and sum up some of the things that I got out of your book and that from this conversation. And it's funny because much of this scientifically wouldn't be overly disputed at all. Things like nature has created these creatures, us, with this conflicting nature between selfishness and altruism and across a bunch of different dynamics. And that through, if we do indeed have free will, which we'll assume here in this conversation, that we then are essentially having to choose between this nature to do the things that are necessary to propagate the continuation of life, and not only of life, but of a good life, a life where we get the deepest senses of joy and meaning from our relationships, primarily within family. That's kind of at the heart of it, the bringing of children into this world and the relationship we have with our children, providing for them. And then we then extend that out to a broader society that's taking care of one another. It's part of maybe like a sort of a beehive concept, right? And all of this is coming about through the natural processes that got us there. Most people say, yeah, that's the way that nature has sort of made us.
Yeah.
But then the only question becomes,
who's nature, or what's nature? You know,
yeah, is it
nature?
Was it this all happened it just happened to be arbitrarily, randomly? It's just because of random chance that we ended up in this, or, and I think you make this case very compellingly, that the processes of evolution are constrained, as you said, by some sort of a mold that puts us into this mold where within that mold, we have a freedom to choose. And that kind of determines what our life and existence is going to be like. And we can find our purpose in a way is to fill into the mold and become what's possible for us to become in the best possible ways and enjoy the fruits of the good life. Yeah. Yeah. And I find that absolutely astounding and interesting in the book.
Yeah, thank you. I remember, you know, when I was thinking about this long before I actually wrote the book, but like 15 years ago, and just these ideas, they just really in a remarkable way, they all seem to come together and make sense. And I remember shortly after I was at a church and I saw a framed copy of the Proclamation on the Family. And it was just like, that is so true. And it just reminded me of some of, you know, this is one of the reasons the family is important, is because it has to do with the way that we were created. Right. Yep. And I just remember seeing that copy of the family, and it was just like, I mean, it was like an intense confirmation that there is deep truth in that document.
And what's wild is that scientifically you can show that we're designed for that proclamation. And the only question is okay, well, what designed us? Was it just chance?
Well, I mean, you know, we are, but we aren't, right? Because we have lots of things pulling us away from it, right? It's not an easy test. It's not an easy walk. You know, the selfishness, the aggression, that stuff has to be overcome or put aside, whatever metaphor you use for it. It's not easy. You know, we have to take apart, if we're going to kind of form a family, there's a part of ourselves that we kind of have to wave goodbye to. Right. Yeah. And so, you know, we can create a culture that helps us go in that direction, or a culture that pushes us in the opposite direction, you know. And I think we need to get back to a culture that is helping us say, no, this is what being a man is about. It's about committing to a woman helping her raise your joint children together. And, you know, that is the epitome of what it means to be a responsible and upstanding adult and man, you know.
And we don't have to do it in some finger wagging way.
No,
it's like, no, that nature is in you. In fact, it's so deeply built into you. There's nothing else that will satisfy you the way that will, if you, you know, take up that responsibility that you have deep within your DNA. I mean, quite literally. So, well, thank you so much. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think you did a great job. Thanks for, you know, thanks for your quotes and your informed questions. So, yeah.
Well, excellent. Well, I just want everyone to know you've only gotten a little bit of a sample in this interview of the stuff in the book. So you all need to go out. You need to get yourself a copy of the book Purpose by Samuel T. Wilkenson. What evolution and human nature apply about the meaning of our existence. As I said, we've only scratched the surface. If you enjoyed this conversation, you will love the book. So be sure to go out and get that book. And if people want to get the book, where do you recommend they get it from?
Lots of different places. It's distributed by Simon & Schuster. Amazon's fine. Barnes & Noble has it. I think Target has it. I'm not sure how many people buy books from Target, but I guess some do. So, yeah. So
excellent. Well, I will be including a link to that Amazon link to the book in the video description. So if you guys want to get the book, you can get it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilkenson, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.